Should we be like on camera all the time?
Yeah, you can stay on this.
Okay. Yeah, you want to be on camera, so.
Oh, wait, I'm gonna change one more thing.
Because I was like, this is actually this, but
I changed one more thing here. So we've got it both here and up there. All right, welcome, both locally, the few of you who did come to this room, and those of you who are on Zoom. This is Friday Fun Talks. Hey, we do this twice a month, or every other week, and we've been doing it for almost a year now. In fact, in 2 talks from now will be our official 1-year anniversary, and it's not booked right now. So as always, I'm looking for speakers. If you're interested in speaking about anything, it's all volunteers. Please let me know. If you're here, there's some sheets you can fill out if you have an idea and you want to submit it, or you can just contact me on Slack or email or any other way you can get a hold of me. There's more information about Friday Fun Talks at go/FFT. You can see all of the past talks, there's recordings, and details of all of those, and the upcoming talks. Right now, in 2 weeks, we have scheduled a talk by Bob Dean about Burning Man, where he went earlier this year. And then after that, the schedule is completely open. If nobody else books the one after that, maybe I'll do it as like an anniversary of the first one I did a year ago. I just got to figure out what to talk about. But I'm always looking for ideas, so please submit if you have anything you want to do. Other than that, I'm going to hand it over, without further ado, to Hersh and Sebastien for our very first pair talk about astrophotography.
Thanks. Yeah. Hi everybody. So I'm Sebastien, and Hersh and I are going to talk today about astrophotography, and specifically how to photograph the Milky Way and other objects in the sky. And before we start, I'm going to introduce myself real quick. So I joined ATG 2 years ago, and my background originally is engineering and more specifically aerospace and robotics. But I've been looking at the sky since like 2004, so basically in high school. And I've been on and off since then because it's a pretty time-consuming hobby. But yeah, so how about you, Hersh?
Yeah, so my name is Hersh. I'm from the AV Maps team. This is actually my second time doing a Friday Fun Talk, so you might have seen me up here before. So I'm an amateur photographer. I got into astrophotography about 2 years ago when I went out to the dark sky areas in Utah, Nevada, Arizona, that region. I basically was born and brought up in, not born, but grew up in New York City and the surrounding region. And so when I went out there and just saw the night sky for the first time without any light pollution, I was just amazed by the number of stars and the number of things you can see in the night sky. And I just wanted to kind of capture that experience and bring it back with me. And so that's how I ended up like taking photos of the night sky. So I really like astrophotography because it's it intersects a lot of my interests and hobbies, from physics, astronomy, photography, engineering, hiking. It gives me a really nice excuse to go out to these remote locations and go on hikes, and then get a great workout carrying an extra 10 to 20 pounds of like camera equipment to do photography. And so this image on the right side is a nice example of what I mean. This is at Yosemite. I basically hiked up Half Dome, and then came back and then was camping out in the middle of the night, and you could see the Milky Way in all its glory there. So it's a really, I find it's a really interesting hobby. It's pretty cool to be able to photograph the night sky, and I hope that some of you take away some of that after the end of this.
Did it look like that to the naked eye, or is that after some, like, does it look different in the image?
So we'll get into a little bit of that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't look that much off.
Yeah, wow.
So.
Yeah, sure. Can you put? Yeah. So before we go into details, I just wanted like to have a little reminder about what are the different scales at stake when we talk about astronomical objects. So that's a very nice video that zooms out from Google headquarters, whatever. We didn't find a video from Google headquarters. And so yeah, basically we in Earth atmosphere right now, and then we get out of it, and we're you can see the moon soon that is orbiting Earth. And as you zoom out a little bit further, you're in the solar system, so you're gonna have the orbits of all the other planets. So first Mars, and then the asteroid belt. And as you zoom out even more, then you have Jupiter, Saturn, and basically that's the solar system. As you move away from the solar system, you got a couple probes that got lost around here. But basically, you're gonna have nearby stars. The closest star is Proxima Centaurus. And then as you move away from those stars, then you're basically in the galaxy. I mean, we're already in the galaxy with this. This is like the Milky Way with like millions of stars. And those are like pretty much the shots you see at night. We'll talk about that later. And as you zoom out even more, you get out of the Milky Way, and you have a local region of neighbor galaxies. Andromeda Galaxy, which is the closest galaxy to the Milky Way, which is the one right there. And then this belongs to a bigger cluster of galaxies and so on. And those objects are now out of reach of the astrophotographer, but most of the objects we saw before, you can actually shoot them. So yeah, that was just an overview so that to remind everybody of the scales that are at stake here. Yeah, so a little bit slower this time, so that we have time to talk about it a little more. So basically, what's up in the sky? First, the closest objects to Earth that are interesting for astrophotographers, surprisingly, are man-made objects. So you can see a lot of those very nice pictures that are sometimes taken accidentally, sometimes on purpose, of a plane in front of the moon, for example. Like astronomers, amateur astronomers, managed to take pictures of satellites. And this one here is a picture of the International Space Station in front of the sun. That was a pretty cool shot. And that's like 400 kilometers away from Earth, basically. As you go further away, you can take pictures of the moon, which is one of the easiest things to do. But there are many different shots of the moon you can do. You can have like this kind of landscape where you mix up the moon with some terrestrial landscapes, which is pretty cool. And other shot that Hersh will tell you about a little later in the presentation. So that's like 400,000 kilometers to give you like an idea. As you move even further away, you have something much bigger, but so that's the same apparent diameter in the sky, which is the sun, as we all know. Then, so that was 150 million kilometers. Then the closest you get to another planet is actually Venus, at 40 million kilometers. And the furthest planet away is Pluto, if we consider it still a planet. And I just wanted to show you very quick those two pictures, which are two photos of Jupiter. On the right, it's taken like a couple of weeks ago by the Juno probe, which shows the south pole of Jupiter, which is a pretty nice angle. And on the left side, it's basically a handheld iPhone taking a picture through binoculars. And then you can see Jupiter and the 4 moons of Jupiter. So that's how accessible astrophotography is. It's actually like pretty easy to come up with a picture of like planets and moons of Jupiter. It's actually pretty easy. All right. So as we saw, we're in the Milky Way. So you can actually, the first galaxy you can shoot is our galaxy. On the right picture, you can see a picture of the Milky Way I took in Colorado a couple of months ago. And so if you zoom in on all those different areas of the Milky Way, you can see some very weird and interesting objects The other picture on this slide shows a star cluster. So it's a region of the sky which has like millions of stars. Like it's usually like star incubators. That's how they call them. And so that's one of the interesting objects you can find in the Milky Way. And that takes you to a couple light years first. So like basically the closest star is 4 light years. So that's about 9, it's like in the trillion kilometers. Light year is like, as everybody knows, like the distance that light travels in a year. And the extent of the Milky Way is about like 40,000 light years, I believe. So that gives you a sense of scales here. And we can actually see outside of the Milky Way. So if we go one step further, you can actually observe galaxies that are obviously outside of our galaxy, and they're actually huge. I mean, one of them is huge. Like for example, Andromeda galaxy, if you were able to increase the brightness of it, it would actually be like 4 times as big as the moon in the sky. So this is something that most people don't know, but if you have a reasonable camera and a zoom lens, you can take a picture of another galaxy. And other things like supernova and things like that. If you have a question about that, we can talk about that later. But yeah, that's the idea. And Hersh.
So at a very high level, I sort of categorize astrophotography into 3 subcategories. Lunar or planetary photography, Milky Way photography, which is what people think of when they, or Milky Way core photography, which is what people think of when they think of Milky Way photography, and then deep space objects, whether they be other stars or other galaxies or things like the Large Magellanic Cloud.
What is that?
Do you want to answer that question?
I think they're like started cloud that are like orbiting. I think they're orbiting our galaxy.
It's basically I think it's like space debris of like stars that are that have either exploded or being born, right, and dust. So the reason I divide astrophotography into these 3 categories is they kind of map really well into the type of equipment you are required for photographing the objects, as well as the amount of knowledge required to actually, and the amount of practice required in order to get good shots. So you can see on the right-hand side, there's an example of each of these. And well, I'll get into exactly the specifics of what it is required in order to take pictures of planets or the Milky Way or deep space objects. So, but before you can do that, there's some general things you need. So you probably want a DSLR or mirrorless system, something where you can manually control, camera system where you can manually control things like shutter speed, aperture, ISO. Because the objects that we're trying to photograph are really dim in the sky, you want preferably a DSLR that is that can go up to a fairly high ISO without introducing a lot of noise. You'll also need a sturdy tripod and probably a shutter release system so you don't accidentally shake the camera while you're trying to photograph these things, and a lens. Most photographers usually have that type of equipment, and that's a really good way to get into astrophotography if you're trying to capture the Milky Way. And you're a photographer, you probably already have everything you need. But if you're trying to do deep space astrophotography, things can get really expensive really fast. Large telescopes can run upwards of $10,000. You probably require an equatorial mount, a lot of counterweight, like you can see on that picture right there. CCDs, people modify their camera systems so that they accept more of the infrared spectrum and less of the visible wavelengths, because a lot of these things emit a lot of infrared light. So that's a little bit more complicated, and we'll get into that towards the end of the talk. But for now, here's kind of the stuff I use. So this is most of my equipment. Covers everything that I've taken my shots with. So here at the bottom is my DSLR. I have a 35 millimeter f1.8 prime lens. I actually have that here. A 50 millimeter, I have my tripod, my shutter release system. And then I have a wide angle lens, 70 to 200 millimeter lens, and then this big boy here. That's 150 to 600 millimeter lens, right? And along with that, I also have a portable star tracker that I use for basically what the star tracker does at a very high level is the Earth rotates, and so when you're shooting long exposures, things in the sky tend to move. The star tracker will move your camera at the same rate as the Earth's rotation, which is, I think, about 460 meters per second, so that the relative position of each object in the sky from the frame of reference of your lens is the same. So there's a couple other nice things to keep in mind. You're out in the night sky, you want a flashlight, you want extra batteries, and then duct tape to make sure that when you're focusing in on something, you don't accidentally hit the focal ring and shift your focus.
Yeah, so this is part of my equipment. So this is, sorry, I'm gonna stay on camera. So this is my parents' house in the south of France, and that's where like most of my gear is because it's kind of expensive to bring it over to the US. But yeah, basically that was in the middle of the night. I was actually playing cards there. But like, yeah, so this is an example of what we call equatorial mount or German mount, which is like a sort of like bigger version of the tracker you were talking about. On it, you have like a refractor telescope, so basically with lenses that magnifies the light from the stars, and then you have either you have power supply, or you can also use a battery to power the motor of the mount. Yeah, and I took this picture with a Fuji mirrorless camera, so that's the basic setup.
Right. So I guess, so once you have kind of your camera, the first thing to do is kind of get familiarized with your equipment. And so when you're getting started, oh wow, this is really hard to see in this display. Sorry. When you're getting started, the first thing you want to make sure is you kind of really know your way around your camera, around your tripod, things like that. It's extremely dark outside when you go to take some of these shots, and often extremely cold, especially if you're at a high altitude location. And so you don't want to be fumbling around in the middle of your night trying to figure out, how do I make my tripod move around this axis, or how do I connect my shutter release system to my camera? So the best way to get familiar with your equipment is to do exactly what I did here. Just go out to your front yard or your backyard and start taking some pictures. So this shot is literally right in the front of my house. You can see there's a glow from the lamp in front of the front yard. And it's kind of hard to see here, but it's really clear on the computer screen. But you can see the Big Dipper up here. And so you can already capture something that's kind of interesting in the night sky, even if you're just outside your yard. And this shot was just taken from my backyard. Like you can see, there's a lot of light pollution, but you can still see some stars out in the night sky. This actually was just me sitting in my morning room through the window and just playing around with my equipment. So obviously these are not really fantastic shots, but that's not the point. The point is for you to be familiar with your equipment and to test things out, so that when you go out into whatever location you're going to go to travel to, with all this stuff, you are ready and mentally prepared for the shots you're going to take. But unfortunately, if that's all you do and you go out and you start shooting stars, stuff like this will happen. cloud will get in the way of your shot, and so you can kind of see the Milky Way in the background, but a big cloud's in the way. Or it'll be a full moon, and so this is not the daytime. This is a moon that is lighting up the night sky like this, and it's kind of amazing when you go out there and you see this for the first time. Or worse yet, there'll be light pollution from a neighboring town, or in this case, a truck that was passing by a couple hundred meters. And so if you want to get good nighttime shots, there's a little bit more prep work you need to do. The key ingredients to getting really nice astrophotography is to make sure you're in a place with low light pollution, in a place with clear skies, and somewhere where you have reasonable temperatures. Again, this last part is kind of key because you're in the middle of the night in some secluded area, probably on top of a mountain, or in the middle of a desert. And astrophotography is a fairly static hobby. You're not moving a lot. You're just sitting there waiting for the camera to just go through its motions. And so you want to make sure you have something to keep you warm and it's not like freezing, because freezing temperatures also affect battery. Right. So on the top right here, you can see something I got from Clear Dark Sky, which is a website that I've linked to, and it gives you cloud cover, transparency, wind, humidity, temperature, general darkness of the sky, which is basically a measure of light pollution. And the point of this is you want to go wherever you're planning on traveling for your astrophotography shots. You want to take a look at a map, like a forecast like this, and so you can plan out, okay, there'll be some cloud at say 10 or 11, but by 1 a.m. they kind of disappear, and so that'll help you figure out what time you want to go out there. This is also all the apps I have on my phone related to astrophotography, mainly to help me kind of make changes on the fly when I'm at the location and I don't have my laptop and an internet connection to figure out what I'm doing. Here, this is a kind of an important map. It shows the light pollution in the United States, right? If you want to capture nighttime objects like the Milky Way, you really want to be in the black, dark gray, dark blue-ish areas. You don't want to be out here on sort of the eastern seaboard in the middle of Manhattan or something, right? Way too much light pollution, you're not even going to see a single star. One thing to note here, though, is that it doesn't take into account elevation, and so if you're on the Appalachian Mountains, you're way above like all the cities, and you'll definitely be able to get some good shots. So,
what about going on the water? Have you ever considered that? Because that's clearly the
so the water
light pollution.
So this is actually that's a good point. So this website has light pollution map for the entire world, and if you go, you'll see like the undeveloped areas and the currently developing areas will not have a lot of light pollution, and then the entire water is just black. It's amazing.
I've seen like the best I've ever seen stars was when I was on a cruise and I got away from the main part of the that had some light. So, but I don't know, would it be possible to stabilize the camera for that?
So it's probably not possible. I personally have never tried, but I would suspect there's way too much movement because of waves. Even in really stable waters, like if you're on a cruise ship, it's a really heavy object, and as it's moving,
I need some really advanced equipment.
I don't even know if it's possible because the equipment you have has no way of measuring and immediately counteracting the forces that are applied on the cruise ship. You could take a little canoe out there, I guess, in the middle of like the Atlantic or the Pacific.
NASA has a Boeing 747 with a telescope, and they're tracking pretty small objects while flying a 747. So
there you go.
Maybe they can do it.
So that's the thing. Actually, planes are a lot more stable than ships, and so there are actually some really nice shots of like the Milky Way that people have taken while flying over like someplace in like a commercial airliner or while flying over the Northern Lights. And so you can probably get away with like planes, probably not cruise ships. All right, so I guess the first thing to talk about is photographing the Milky Way. So when people think about the Milky Way, they think of right, we're obviously in the Milky Way, right? But this is the core of the Milky Way. All of these stars are in the Milky Way, but this is the thing that people think of when they think of photographing the Milky Way, is that core. And so, like I alluded to, in order to photograph this, it's really kind of fairly easy from an equipment standpoint. Just get a DSLR, get a prime lens, something like a f2.8 or faster. So this is f1.8, 1.4, or something like that. Wide angle, so 16 to 35 millimeters tends to work well. And a sturdy tripod. And you're pretty much set. It's nice to have a star tracker. It's not necessary. I'll show you some photos of with and without a star tracker and kind of show you the difference. So the key thing is just always shoot in RAW. You'll see why. Go to a dark sky spot. So somewhere that is like in this region, not in this region. And if you don't have a star tracker, we use something called the rule of 500 or the rule of, which basically says take 500, divide by your focal length. So if you have a 24 millimeter, right, that's what, about 20-ish, right? And so that's the maximum exposure time in seconds that you can take before you start seeing star trails because of the rotation of the Earth, right? So that's a nice like little rule for you to have in your back pocket if you're out in somewhere, right? If you have a 35 millimeter, you divide by 500, you probably can get away with 15 to 20 seconds, no more than that before you'll start seeing star trails. And you know, it's nice to have an interesting foreground for good Milky Way photography. So this is a photo from my trip last year to Hawaii on Mount Mauna Kea on the Big Island of Hawaii. You can see I'm well above the city lights here that are below me. There's some stars up at the top, and I was able to get this shot, right? This is just a single shot that I took with my 16 millimeter wide angle lens. I only had to expose it for about 25 seconds, and because it's so dark out in Hawaii, you can see all of this detail. So, so the reason you want to start shooting RAW is this, right? So you take a picture, there's some detail in there, but if you post-process it, you can get a lot more color information out. And you can see a lot more. So down here, this is kind of hard to see. I'm not sure if people on Zoom will be able to see what I'm pointing to, but if you go to the post-process shot, you can see that like that part of the Milky Way is really bright once you've pulled out some of the color information, increase the contrast. And you can't do that if you're shooting JPEG, right? All these dots that are stars are probably going to become compressed, and like you won't get a really nice picture if you're shooting JPEG. So don't do that. Here's another example where, like, I mean, you can go really overboard on the right-hand side of like oversaturating the colors. But this is something I took with this 35 millimeter lens. And then I just did 5 shots vertically stacked up. And so these are all the same image. They're just like different post-processing filters applied on top of them. This is also, again, in Hawaii. But it's also nice to have a star tracker. So I just got my star tracker, and earlier this year I went to Cadillac Mountain up in Acadia National Park, and I took these shots, which were taken with I think about a 2-minute exposure on the star tracker, and so you can see what the star tracker does, right? This night sky is very clear, even with a 2-minute exposure. You don't see any star trails or motion, which if you go back to my old image, with some of these, you might, if you zoom in enough, you can see that. But on the other hand, because the camera is moving, your foreground is going to start shifting. And so down here, if you look really closely, you can see the trees kind of like moving. There's also like light painting with people moving around with red lights and stuff. But the night sky is really clear. And so when you're using a star tracker for these long exposures and you want a foreground and a background, you probably want to take 2 shots and combine them so that the foreground and background are clear. But if you zoom in on one of these images, like this one here, you can see each star is a single pixel, right? There's a lot more detail that's coming out. Down here, this bright object, I think is Mars. There's a lot more stars you can see in the Milky Way core. And that's really the key benefit of having a star tracker for Milky Way shots. So that's a bit about Milky Way photography. When you are doing, say, lunar or solar photography, the biggest difference is that you want a super telephoto lens. I mean, this thing is basically a telescope, right? But you want something that is 300 millimeters or more and have a sturdy tripod. But on the other hand, you have a lot more relaxed weather requirements, right? If you're trying to shoot the moon, you can do it in the middle of the city. It actually can make for an interesting foreground, even with city lights. You just need to be able to see the moon, right? Like, and so if there's a cloud passing by, if the cloud goes away, you can shoot the moon to your heart's content. It's also emitting a lot more light in the night sky, and so you don't need to be sitting there taking 3-minute long shots. You can probably get away with like half a second or something, probably even faster than that. So last year, we also had this amazing solar eclipse, right? And I drove out to Carbondale, Illinois, which is about a 10.5-hour drive from here. The night before the eclipse, camped out in the back of my car, and then just took my giant lens, the telezoom lens here, and started photographing the eclipse. So here you can see the sun and the moon kind of like starting to come in front of the sun. The clouds are sort of in the way. Luckily, they were moving to the right, and so to the left, I guess, from this perspective, and they disappeared. But the key, one of the things to note here is like if you are shooting with like a telezoom lens, like a 600 millimeter, these things are going to move really fast through your field of view. And so if you don't have a star tracker or a equatorial mount, then you're going to need to manually readjust this so that the sun and the moon are in the center of the frame. And you're going to have to do that a lot. So this is just a couple of shots from the eclipse. You can see the solar flare over here, some more shots. And I guess I'll hand it over to you to talk a bit about shooting planets.
Sure, thanks. All right, so I'm gonna talk a little bit about more like my experience of astrophotography. So when I started, I didn't have enough money to buy a fancy DSLR because I was in high school. And those were actually pretty expensive back then. Like now, I think you can buy one of those for like $500. And back then, it was more like $1,000 or something. So I was like, okay, what can I do? What can I observe with like $300 bucks? And it turned out that planets is like the easiest subject for this kind of budget. So you can, if you want to photograph planets, you can basically buy, it's called a Newton telescope for $300 and then just use a webcam. So I did have a webcam back then. Yeah, so that's what I went for. So briefly, what is the difference between a Newton telescope and what we call a refractor telescope? So you can see this little diagram here. Basically, a reflector, as it says, is basically as a mirror in the back. It's reflecting the light of a star or of a planet and focusing it on a secondary mirror that then projects the image on the
I think
eyepiece.
my computer crashed.
Oh yeah.
All right. Well,
Oh, that's fine.
that's fine. Just keep on talking. I'll
Yeah.
put
So-
slides.
It has 2 mirrors, so you lose a little bit of resolution of the image is not that crisp because it has to go over like 2 mirrors. It depends on how good the quality of the mirror is, obviously. But for $300, you get like something pretty basic. But it's a very good value telescope because it allows you to collect a lot of light and have a rather big. This is a 130 millimeter diameter, so it's like that wide, and it's like a meter long, basically. And this is a good entry level telescope. So on the other hand, you have refractors, which is basically, this is a refractor here, where you don't have mirrors, you have just a series of lenses. And usually it gives you a more crisp image and more contrast. It's nicer to look at, but it's way more expensive. And usually you cannot get that big in term of lenses, because then you get some chromatic aberrations on the sides, and you have like it's more expensive, basically. The good thing is you can actually see vampires with reflectors. So white planets. So first, it's rather cheap, and then you actually don't need any motor, because those planets are so bright in the sky. They're so bright in the skies that you actually don't need a long pose. You can just have like a regular pose that doesn't smear the planet across your screen, across the picture. Then you can do it from Pittsburgh, no problem. Those are very bright, so you're not affected by light pollution, and those are very easy to find. If you have like Hersh will show you, I think, a software that you can use to find those planets, and they're very easy to find. So that was my first target. Here, it's this one. Yeah. So basically, I don't know if you see very well, but since you're using a webcam or like some like low quality sensor, most of the time you're gonna have a very blurry picture. So you don't want to stop at one shot. You want to use the entire storage of your hard drive. Actually, like basically, maybe not now, but back then you want to take like thousands of pictures. If you have a like 60 FPS webcam, it's actually pretty quick to take this shot. And then what you're gonna do is that you're gonna align all those pictures together, because since you don't have a motor, because you don't have that much money, you actually have to manually recenter the planet in the sensor every now and then. But it's actually, you have some automated procedures to align the picture, so that's not really a problem. Then eventually you stack them up. So by doing that, you actually improve the signal to noise ratio. The noise is coming from different sources, coming from like we'll see that in the next slide, but basically the main obstacle here is the disturbances of the atmosphere. So even though it's a nice sky without clouds, you still have a lot of fluctuations that are gonna basically convolve your image with some random disturbances. So as you stack those shots, you basically statistically cancel out the cancellation. So basically that's how you get a better picture. And eventually you can use some contrast enhancement, or like some frequency filtering. Something that's being used a lot in the community for those are wavelets, because they allows you to actually to change the weight of different frequencies in the image. So this way you can really tweak the picture to see the details and things like that. For Saturn, for example, what you want to start seeing in the beginning is separation in the rings of Saturn. So you can probably see on the process picture here, but basically that's, if you wanted to start planetary imaging, that would be the first thing you would be proud of, is the first time you actually resolve the central separation, not the one between the globe and the rings, but the one in the middle of the rings. So yeah, those are like some of my, and we don't really see it. Oh yeah, that's not too bad actually. So my first shots, like maybe like 10 years ago or something. And so you can, Saturn is the easiest, and also it's usually you're pretty proud of it because it's pretty and you can show it to your parents and stuff. You can still do that. Jupiter is nice as well because you actually see the moons, and depending on the day, you actually have a different constellation of moons. Sometimes you don't see one of the moons because it's hidden behind Jupiter. Sometimes you also have a transit of the moon in front of Jupiter, and it at least gives you like a unique picture because it was taken at that time with this position of the satellites. Finally, Mars is, I think, the most challenging of those that are like within reach of with this kind of equipment. But yeah, I think this one I was able to take maybe after like a couple of years of experience, and you gotta get lucky. You gotta get like a very clear night and very stable atmosphere, and then you can start seeing some features of the surface, like the ice on the pole and other like seas and features that you can then recognize on the map. Yeah, so that was planetary. It's very good to start with. But then eventually, you know, there is a very limited number of planets. So, and you want to explore a little bit further away. And so if you get into deep sky objects, there is a much steeper learning curve. You need much more equipment. So for example, you actually need a motorized mount, a DSLR camera. You need a clear sky, so you cannot do that from your balcony in Pittsburgh. And you need a lot of patience. Data collection is much harder because you actually not only need to take pictures of the object of interest, you also need to calibrate your camera. So basically, when you take long poses, you are also increasing the temperature of your sensor. You're like, a lot of the hardware in the sensor is creating a noise coming from the different electronics and so on. So you also want to take pictures with the lead on your telescope, so that you can then subtract those those noise patterns from the picture. There are also other shots you need to take, like for example, this offset picture, which is this one here, which is basically you put a T-shirt on top of your telescope during daytime, and you get a sensitivity map of your sensor. This one is, you don't have to do it, but it'll be useful. You'll see why. And yeah, so like taking all those pictures takes a lot of time and motivation. But once you get it, then you can start processing it basically. And the process is a bit similar as the planetary photography. You basically you need to align and stack all your pictures for the same reason, because you need to get as much signal as possible, cancel out the zero-centered noise and these kind of things. Then you need to subtract what we call the darks. So the darks are what I was talking about, like basically the noise from the camera itself. Then you get basically this picture here, which is like a much better resolution from single shots, but still suffers from this non-homogeneous sensitivity of the sensor. So then if you divide by this flat, basically a field map, then you can get a reasonable result. So this is M51, which is the Whirlpool galaxy, and with like 50 shots of 60 seconds. So that's already like an hour of being outside, using your shutter release every minute, or you also can automate that. But the reason why you want to do 60 shots of 1 minute instead of one shot of 60 minutes is because your tracking, even if you use a motor, is never going to be accurate enough to keep your picture sharp for 60 minutes in a row. Also, like, you never know what happens. Like, maybe a car drives down the road and it creates vibration, and it basically ruins your picture. That's how lucky you have to be to get the perfect shot. But basically, you also have to stay another hour for all those darks, those guys here, because you also need to take them in the same conditions, because they also depend on the external temperatures and all those factors. So you also need to, that's like 2 hours for a single picture. In the clear skies, you need to go somewhere isolated. So you need to be motivated, but it's worth it. Basically that was it for deep sky objects, and I'll leave the conclusion to you, Hersh.
So I mean, I think this is a good example of the type of stuff you can shoot. This is the North American Nebula, I think.
Yeah. Because it looks like North America.
Yeah, because it looks like North America. Kind of. But this actually, you don't even need a telescope on this. And so you can shoot this with a 200 millimeter lens, which, I mean, is much more reasonable than this thing, this little thing. And this is not that heavy. It's probably like half the weight of this guy. And so, yeah, you kind of do the same type of process. Take a couple of hours, go somewhere dark, and shoot pictures. It's really important to have some planning, especially when you're going to be spending 3 to 5 hours a night in the middle of nowhere. You know, probably spending another 5 hours to get there, another 5 hours to come back.
Plus image processing time.
Plus image processing time, yes. And so something that I wanted to get a demo of, but I couldn't get running on my laptop was, if we go back here in the equipment section, Stellarium, which is a really, really useful tool. You can go and download it for, basically whatever you want. It's basically a little tool that lets you go and say, okay, this is where I am in the world. Here's what the night sky is going to look like. Here's where all my objects are going to be. You put in it even has a setting. So you put in your camera. My camera is a Nikon D750. It is a full frame camera. It has this many pixels by this many pixels. Each pixel is this many microns, micrometers or whatever. And this is my lens. And then you can scan the night sky for things that are interesting, given your personal setup, right? And so when you go out there, you know you're going to be positioned here. You have your compass, again on the phone app. And then you just kind of go up into and follow the map of the night sky to figure out exactly where you want to be oriented for taking your shots, and it's really helpful for planning.
Have you ever tried like the Google Sky Map application on your phone? You know what that?
Like, is that augmented reality? Oh yeah.
You just kind of. You move your phone around and it shows you roughly what you're looking at.
Yeah.
That was built here in Pittsburgh by some Google
I
engineers.
think now most apps do have that feature, so probably Stellarium for your phone also has that.
Yeah, Stellarium on my phone also has that. Yeah. The full-blown desktop app, I think, has a bunch more control, right? It also has an entire catalog of objects, right? So I think most of these apps will be able to point out the planets and like the major constellations and stuff like that. But if you want to photograph like the North American Nebula, I'm pretty sure most of them probably, besides Stellarium, I don't know of many that would. Stellarium on the phone actually has pretty much the same interface as the desktop app. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
I just wanted to like sort of conclude with like, so basically I didn't really know Hersh before we met for this presentation, and that was funny because we realized that we sort of like attacked this astrophotography thing from very different angles. Like you started with photography.
Yep.
So that's why you have all this gear already for photography. I started more from the like astronomy side, and basically there's so many things you can do. It's like if you're more into hiking, then actually you may also not bring anything and just like look at the sky. You don't need to take pictures.
Yeah.
But like you can also just go there and just with you don't even need like a tracker. You can actually take star trails pictures. We didn't show any of those like circumpolar pictures with star trails, but you can also do that. So it's really like there are many angles from which you can attack astrophotography. So yeah, we try to present two of them at least, but probably you can also come up with your own approach to astrophotography.
Questions?
What tools do you use to do all that image processing you do? What do you use?
So I'm using a tool that is mostly like in French, I think. Like, but I think now there is like an English version of it. Yeah, no, so basically this guy, Serial, it's a rather low-level tool. It needs to understand, I would say, like a couple of things first. I think you can get very good results using those tools here, like Deep Sky Stacker. It's kind of like an automated pipeline where you just like dump all your shots, and then it's gonna figure out the alignment, the different like darks, flats, how to add those. This tool is more like a low level where you would like, there's a little command line where you can import all your raw, convert them, align them, make like addition pictures with that, subtraction, things like that. But yeah, I think there is also something called Registax. I didn't put in the list, Registax. But like if you Google astrophotography processing tools, you're gonna probably end up on Deep Sky Stacker. Some people use Photoshop as well. If you want to do a little bit more like fine control, and then I recommend this guy here.
I have no experience with those advanced software, but I mean, for stuff like Milky Way photography, usually Lightroom is my go-to because you know it can handle most of the basic stuff.
Or dark table if you're more into the free software.
Yes. Or if you're not on Windows and you're on Linux.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Lightroom and Photoshop, and then Deep Sky Stacker probably is mostly what I use. So yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah, I've got a question about you mentioned bring duct tape, and I kind of didn't understand what the point of the duct tape was.
Oh, sure. So this is my camera, right? And there's a focal ring here that helps you focus on the night sky objects, right? So the way you want to, so maybe I should go over this. The way you want to focus on a night sky object, right, is you turn it on, you look at the live view, and then you find the thing you want to focus in on. You zoom in at like as far as your live view will let you go, and then you move this. And when you're focusing close to infinity, it's like a couple of millimeters here or there will quickly throw things out of focus. And so the reason you want duct tape is to be able to mark that off on your focal ring, and so that you don't accidentally when you're like moving around or like attaching your shutter release system, or when you're especially when you're working with like equatorial mounts or star trackers, you kind of have to do this, and then you have to put the star tracker on and put it on a tripod, and then put the lens back on, and then you're touching a lot of different objects at the same time, and you don't want to accidentally move one of these off by a couple of millimeters because it'll completely destroy your shot. And so that's why basically you just bring duct tape, you tape it around your focal ring, and it ensures that like your focus, once you've set it, is going to stay there for the entire night.
What if they make lenses that just actually allow you to lock it in place and make it harder to like nudge by accident?
So they have certain lenses that will, I don't know if any of mine do that. I think this one does. This one has a focal lock.
Yeah.
Right. So you kind of like, so this is 600 millimeters, by the way. And then you just lock it in. Oh, sorry, this is not a focal lock. Sorry, I'm sorry. This is a zoom lock. Yeah, focal locks, most lenses, I don't think I've ever seen a lens that has a focal lock. I think I've only seen zoom locks.
I think it would be useful for this.
Yeah, it'd be useful, but you know, I got gaffer tape for like $2, like $5 on Amazon, and it does the same thing.
Yeah, that's also the fun part about this. Is like you always need to come up with some like tricks to make things work. Like so, it's a little bit DIY in some cases.
Yeah. Any other questions?
See any aliens?
I will say one night I was in college and I was sleeping out and just looking up at the night sky, and I saw a green thing shoot by, and I could have sworn it was like a UFO or something. It was probably just like a comet.
Yeah.
But I didn't realize it was like.
I had similar experience as a kid. I think it was like multicolored kind of thing. It's like, I don't know, it looked like something like a rainbow trail coming off of it.
Yeah.
So I had no idea what it was. I never learned what it was, but it probably was just some sort of rock. Yeah.
Was that cat thing?
Yeah, right. The man. All right. I think I get. Oh no, you have a.
Yeah. So for the Star Tracker, what type of tripod do you have for your camera? Does it have to be like a more stable one, or can it be just?
Well, so this Star Tracker is a pretty lightweight mobile one, and so I just use my normal tripod, which I mean it's a Vanguard Alta Pro Plus. So this is like probably a mid-range tripod. It's not like carbon fiber fanciness. It's only, but it works pretty well for that. I think for equatorial mounts and things of that sort, you need something pretty heavy duty.
It also depends on what you're gonna put on top of the tracker. Like if you only have a DSLR without this like gigantic lens, then I think it's fine. If you have like something heavier, then I guess you need.
Yeah. So this thing, the motor is not strong enough to be able to move something like this. This is probably at the limit of what it can handle. I think yours, you can.
Yeah, this can take 15 kilograms of payload. So, but the tripod is sewed together with the mount, so you don't really have to care about that.
I mean, you're not gonna take this thing and go up, hike on top of Half Dome, and then like sleep there in the middle of the night and start shooting pictures. You can. I'm not strong enough to do that.
And I wouldn't really fly with that.
Yes. So fun story. The counterweight here, the FAA classifies that as a potential weapon. And so I took this I flew to Boston on my way to Acadia National Park, and I was stopped, and like when you go through the security lines, they kept on like taking the package out, and they're like, oh, okay, I guess it's just part of camera equipment, and then like let you go. So if you're gonna travel with one of these, you can just make sure you allow for that and buffer that in your time at the airport, because that is technically a weapon.
All right, well, I think we're out of time, so thanks for coming, everybody, and thank you for the presentation, guys. And come back in a couple weeks for Burning Man. Let me know if you got any talk topics you want to.